Executive Director here at the Sun Valley Museum of Art, and I'm thrilled to see such a turnout tonight. This is really great fun. You are all in for a treat. Kimberly Davis, who's going to talk a lot about sort of how she got here, so I won't go into great detail, is a longtime friend. We went back to the 80s earlier today. But what's really important is that as an art dealer and director of LA Louver Gallery since the mid-80s, Kimberly has forged these incredible friendships and relationships with so many artists in the art world, not just those that the gallery represented, but artists beyond that. And in particular, David Hockney and Alison Saar, two artists that I think of where you have a very long friendship. When we decided to curate this show from the George Schnitzer collection, we originally did think, or we're hoping to curate a smaller show from a larger David Hockney show, and that's when I immediately thought of bringing Kimberly here. We only have one Hockney, but I know she'll share lots of stories with us. But it really seemed like we wanted to give our audiences the chance to hear from different sort of facets within the art world, from art dealers to printmakers to, unfortunately, most of these artists are not able to be with us, but it just was important that we heard from a diversity of voices. So I am going to turn it over to Kimberly. All these programs that we're doing, and there's several more coming up, including Jennifer Farrell, who is the curator of prints and multiples at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. She will be here on the 19th. And I'm gonna forget the next one, but they're certainly in our calendar, but we have two more programs after Jennifer. All these programs are made possible by the Harold and Arlene Schnitzer Care Foundation, and our exhibition is made possible by the George Schnitzer Family Foundation. So without further ado, Kimberly. Thank you.
I'm going to be a very casual speaker today, and I'm going to go through kind of two different subjects. I'm going to talk first about what's important to me, and then I'm going to give you a sense of history of all of what's here. Because when I heard about this exhibition to begin with, the idea of putting an exhibition from works from 1970-71, because this is when all of this started here, seemed so interesting to me. And I know that there was a huge number of things that they had available to choose from. And then it was like, oh no, but you can't have this and you can't have that. But how all this came about is a history that is kind of lost now, because as we've all gotten older, you don't remember what happened then in the late 1950s when really all of that started. So how I got into this, I've been director of LA Louver for 41 years. I came to being an art dealer reluctantly, intuitively, and without any training whatsoever. But I did, excuse me, I'm going to just record this. I did come to it with a lifelong interest in art, and I had, and so I'm going to just sort of start and give you a little bit of my own history. I was born in California, and I grew up there. My father worked for General Motors, and my mother was a professional woman. She was the personal assistant to Howard Amundsen, at that time, big philanthropist and a home savings and loan bank. It was very important in the development of the LA County Museum, symphonies, everything that was going on in the arts really started with the Amundsens and the Amundsen Foundation. She loved working for him. It was amazing. My sister and I were sort of raised by her mother which meant we had great freedom. And the first art experience I really remember for myself is when Howard Ellinson bought a Rembrandt painting, Raising of Lazarus, and we were taken to his house on June Street, and it was an extraordinary experience, the sense of here was something that had been made 400 years ago, 300 years ago. It was just awe-inspiring, and that left a huge impression for me to be involved in the arts, to be able to learn something more about that. Unfortunately, my father was transferred to Detroit, according to my mother, who had come originally from Minneapolis and did not want to move back into the cold whatsoever. I think she was never really happy after that, but we were in the northwest suburbs of Detroit and had a very kind of liberal, open education, and I took full advantage of all of that. I went to the Detroit Institute of Arts very regularly. I skipped school and went to Cranbrook, played with Mark DeSuvero that was down in the back 40 of that school, really was able to take in all of that. And I thought, I'm going to find a way to put myself into the arts. I had very good art teachers, and so I felt like I was prepared for all of that. So I had 1 year at Wayne State, which was a funky, wonderful school at that time, and then I went to New York ostensibly to study fashion. I had been in high school, I ran a little store where I made all the clothes for what was being done. I thought, this is the world I was going to be in. This is how I was going to translate this into the arts. So I went to Pratt, and I thought, this is great. I had a lot of professional internships that were required as you went through that schooling. And when I got all done with that course, I have a BFA in marketing and in fine arts. I thought, no way am I going into the fashion world. This is the pits. It was, the people were not smart. It was competitive. It was horrible. I thought, okay, back into art history. So I worked at Hunter College for a little bit, but at those days, in order to get an MFA degree, you had to read and write in German. That was beyond me too. So I just, okay, I'm gonna get a job. So I lucked into a job. My first job was with the Clock Tower Gallery, and at that time it was opening PS1, which now is of course part of the Museum of Modern Art. And it gave me an introduction to artists, so many interesting artists all over New York. It was the first exhibition at the Clock Tower that I was involved with was a Michael Asher exhibition. And in the Clock Tower area itself, he took out all the windows. It was January, we were freezing. And I was like, this is art, So we got to question everything. I went on and got an internship at the Guggenheim Museum and was thrilled to have the opportunity to look through the back stacks of everything. I was working with Linda Shearer at that time, who was a contemporary curator. She was pregnant, so I got to do most of her work that year too. So all of that was great. And then I finally got a job that actually paid me, because of course all those internships, you work as a bartender at night, or a waitress or a babysitter. And so you do all those things and then it all comes around. But the first job in the arts actually paid me was working for a woman who was doing corporate consulting. And I went into that world in the mid-1970s. And it was a really pretty interesting way to be getting involved with selling art and looking at art and finding things. And I was deeply involved in the print world at that point, not necessarily at the level of things that what we have here, much more decorative work. But sometimes on a Saturday morning, we would go into a building at IBM and we would install 300 works of art. And by Sunday night, it was all up and people would come in the offices, it would all be done. And I really learned how to place art, how to look at art, how people were going to be able to interact with it. And it was very rewarding for a certain period of time. finally, a friend of mine who had a gallery in New York said, "You have got to get out of this business. You need to be doing something more interesting. And there's an opportunity for you to move to California and work for 3 print publishers and open a little office for them." And so I did that. I worked for Bernard Jacobson, Brooke Alexander, and Bob Felpin from Parasol Press. And I moved to Los Angeles in 1979. And at that point, I had actually never worked in a gallery. I had never experienced all the things that you're supposed to put together in a business. I knew how to run a business, I knew how to sell. You know, I paid everybody, so I felt like I was doing fine. But one day, I was working out of an apartment, and I was continuing to sell to in the corporate world. In Los Angeles at that time, Security Pacific, Bank of America were all building really important collections, and they were very supportive of all of that. I put together little shows of prints that we had published and sent them around to university galleries, just honestly like what Jordan has done now through all of his philanthropy with these things. And from there, one day, Sid Felsen from Gemini took me out to lunch, and he said, "You have to open a gallery. You need a gallery. You need to put all this and make it available for people to see." So then across the street from Gemini, there was a little restaurant that was very popular at the time, La Maison. It was a celebrity hangout. It was a wonderful, crazy place. It was run by Patrick Tarai, who was the nephew of the man who owned Tour d'Argent in Paris. So it had aspirations of being this fancy French restaurant, but it was literally in the parking lot of a bungalow house. It had astroturf on the floor. But David Hockney designed the menus, covers for all of that. He was a regular visitor. And he was one of the first artists that I met when I moved to Los Angeles, because Bernie had done work with him. So he was sort of like a regular person that I was able to see. And that's how I sort of started. And after 6 years of running this gallery, I had been approached by Peter to come and work with him at LA Louvre. I turned him down 3 times. And then finally, in the early part of the 1980s, there was, even though this whole boom of things was just beginning, that then subsequently crashed at the end of the 1980s, we really weren't making a lot of money, and nobody had funded what I was doing. I was doing everything by selling whatever I could sell in order to fund whatever was coming up next. So I was sort of, everyone got paid except me, and many thousands of dollars in arrears. I finally said, okay, I actually have to work for a living. So I went to work with Peter at LA Louvre. And I'm happy to talk more about that, but I wanted to give you that as a basic background for what I have been doing, because 41 years since that time, I've been involved with over 650 exhibitions at the gallery, close to 300 exhibitions, helping with museums in different places, sometimes curating whole exhibitions that have traveled around to different places. But that background that I had to begin with set the tone for everything that I was doing. And one of the things that I learned very early was that the understanding of the prints and what you were looking at and selling or buying and selling had come from a very particular place. And the history of this work and this body of work really goes back not just to 1970, but really to the end of the 1950s. And as through the 1960s, everything became, it was booming everywhere. Businesses were doing well and buying art. They were paying everyone more money. People had more money to buy art. They were buying paintings. They were buying prints. And so the development of that contemporary market really started then. And the print world itself really started with two women. And in Los Angeles, you sort of had the aerospace industry that was developing a lot of new materials, resins and acrylics and polymers and fiberglass, because the aerospace was helping out the war effort of everything that was going on. There was a freedom that came about. Students were protesting everything that was happening. And of course, there was the invention of the pill, which made sort of a sexual liberation that was going on for everyone else. And there were a lot more women in the marketplace than there ever had been. So two women really are at the heart, or at the beginning, of what began this whole print market. One, an extraordinary intuitive intellectual, the other, a really pragmatic artist. First, Tanya Grossman, who came to work on Long Island in West Islip in the late 50s. She'd been born in Russia. She left Russia during wartime, went to Dresden, left Dresden during war, went to Japan, then came to Paris, got involved with fine art printing and working with all of that, but then subsequently left Paris for New York in the early part of the 1950s. Her husband was a printer. She was a printer as well. And they came to New York with the idea in mind of making fine art books. They started by making reproductions of things. Somehow in the front yard of their little house in West Islip, very near where Fire Island was, they found two Bavarian lithographic stones. What are the chances of something like that being buried in the front yard? So they kind of took it as divine providence that this was where we were to go. And they've started making these reproductions of French artists. And she caught the attention of William Lieberman, who was at that time the curator of modern art at the Metropolitan Museum. He came to see what she was doing and said, well, you know, you're doing a really nice job, but I'm not interested in reproductions. Why don't you get involved really and do what you want to do? Be making some books. She said, well, I want to work with contemporary artists, and I don't know anyone because I haven't been here. He said, well, the first person you should meet is Frank O'Hara, and he'll lead you into the world that is there. So the only contemporary artist she knew at that time was a man she'd met on a boat coming over from Paris to New York, and that was Larry Rivers. What are the chances? She called up Larry and said, you know, I'd like to come and talk to you about a project I have in mind. And Larry said, well, come on over. And at his house was Frank O'Hara. They were sitting around having lunch, and she came in and met both of them, proposed what she wanted to do with them in the creation of these deluxe editions of books. Lo and behold, 2 years, 1957 to 1959, a 13-page portfolio was produced, the first thing that they'd done. Well, Larry Rivers was so impressed with what she was doing. He introduced her to Jasper Johns, and Jasper Johns came in, and the first piece he made with her is the piece that's in this exhibition here, Souvenir. Jasper Johns came away and said, wow, the quality of the printing in this place is just incredible. He introduced her to Robert Rauschenberg. Rauschenberg then came in and introduced them to Cy Twombly and Jim Rosenquist and Barney Newman and Jim Dine. And suddenly there was a business, and that business got to work pretty quickly. They didn't make a lot of money, but you know, through the 1960s, artists were happy to get their work out into the world where people couldn't afford to buy paintings, they could afford to buy the prints, they were inexpensive, and you know, ultimately they knew that in time they would be able to do. If things sold for a couple $100, or if it was $1,000, it was a lot of money at that point. But all of that began to change. Tanya Grossman ran a very focused and casual operation. She made lunches for everyone. She would only work with one artist at a time, so everyone had their full attention in the presentation of all of that. And by the end of the 1960s, they had produced over 90 different editions with different artists. The Museum of Modern Art came, selected 97 prints out of the editions, many of which were multiple qualities. And they did an exhibition. They were, at that time, just starting to have a print department at the Museum of Modern Art. That wasn't necessarily considered something that was an important part of contemporary making. Riva Castleman was the curator for all of that, and she put together an exhibition again 10 years later, also using another 90 different works of ULE. And that made an introduction to not only New York, but the world of the importance of an international fine art world that continued to grow. Helen Frankenfeller also worked there, and the printer named Bill Goldston came in. He had a technical expertise that was beyond everything that they had experienced before, and also the ability to bring in new technology with offset printing, with woodcut printing, and Helen Frankenfeller was very interested in all of that. And while the pochoir that's around the corner from us here was not made at ULA, she made other works that were very similar to that. The pochoir is a kind of a screen printing method that uses a stencil and it's hand painted, but she brought a technical expertise in all of that, and it's really fantastic. So on the West Coast, there was another woman who really had a very pragmatic point of view about putting together something with fine art lithography, and that was June Wayne. June was a printer, she was a painter, she was a weaver. She later described herself as a conceptual artist, but that was sort of because she put together this program. She knew that in order to develop a printmaking world and have that expand, that the printers needed to be trained. She had gone to Paris in the late 50s herself, had gone to Waldo Cromlin and to Moorlot, to the major printers that were working in Paris with Picasso and Matisse and Chagall and Miro. And as everything had moved away from Paris and to New York into this world of abstract expressionism, and then later into, of course, pop art and minimal art and conceptual art and performance art and all of that, she knew that in order for these new printers to do this, that she needed to train them. She had to have good printers in order to get good artists to come to California to work beyond just the artists that were already here in California. So she started a program. She laid out a plan, which she presented to the Ford Foundation in 1958, and they gave her a grant of $3 million, which at that time, I mean, would be equal to $18 million now. So she was able to go out and buy the finest presses, the best papers, the best inks, and she brought together a program that trained printers at the Tamarind Studio. And as they trained, they brought in the artists that were working there. And by the time 10 years had passed for her, they had produced 2,900 lithographs from 1960 to 1970. Sadly, there aren't any of those in this exhibition, but she worked with, at that time, Ruth Asava, Via Selmans, Ed Ruscha, Joseph Albers. And probably as important as the development of the master printing program that she outlined which basically trained all printers that went on to open their own print shops throughout the United States. She had the idea of documentation in mind. So the print documentation sheets of everything that went on in the making of every print, including the chops that went onto to identify both the printer and the publisher of the work, was how she felt that you could really develop a professional place. And probably one of the most successful people that came out of it, and what Sid Felsen and Stanley Bernstein, Gemini Graphic Editions Limited, Gemini Gem. And where ULA was making these very abstract works that are dealing with people coming out of abstract expressionism, Gemini concentrated on this developing more corporate market. So they had a very crisp style. They were working with, oftentimes it's the same artist, but in very different manners. Ken Tyler had a very high degree of technical ability, and it seemed to everyone he had his own sort of sense of magic in making things. Well, because of that, he left 4 years later to open his own place in 1973. But he started with them in 1967, left in 73 for his own. But he worked with Ellsworth Kelly, Frank Stella. Stella in particular loved working with Ken. They had a real magic together. And Rauschenberg as well came in. And in this exhibition, there is the very beautiful copper series works, very reminiscent of Stella's black paintings that he really began with in the other time. But this was a time of huge production. And in the same year of 1970-71, Frank Stella made, 17 works in the aluminum series, 2 works in the River Pond series, 2 works in the York Factory, all hard edge works, Newfoundland series, 4 more works, 6 works in the Benjamin Moore. So this publishing house, these printers were working around the clock. It was an extraordinary factory with all of these things. But they were also working with Roy Lichtenstein, who was equally interested in the process of being able to make these very serious prints with these things. And in this mirror series that we have one up on this wall, there were 9 works in that series altogether. And in that year, in working at Gemini, he made 15 works from the Modern Hymn collection and 2 works from through chemistry. And he worked also with printers in New York, Paul Bianchini, and with Citadel Press. So everybody was like, I don't know when anybody went to sleep. And Rauschenberg put them all to shame. In the second room over here, next to the Johns, is a work from the Carved Birds series. He often had a great cunning sense of humor with things, and there are 10 works in that series. And this work here, also by him, signed, which is a collage. It's a screen print, but it's made from a collage of magazine things. This was not printed by Gemini. It was printed by Stereo Studios in New York, but it was originally commissioned to be the cover of Time magazine in 1970s. It was supposed to be a reflection of the previous decade, and it's obviously done that, but they considered it too political, and Time turned it away. Leo Castelli, who was doing well at that time, said, I'm not going to let that go. And he developed, and there were many print publishers who were gallery dealers then at that time as well. Also out of the Tamarin program came Jean Gallant, who opened Sirius in Los Angeles, and he made an effort to work with Los Angeles artists particularly. And although for many years I thought for sure that John Baldassari's piece here, "I Will Not Make Any More Boring Art," was made by Cirrus, it turns out it was actually published by the Nova Scotia College of Art, which had asked John to come and do an exhibition, but didn't have the funds to fly him from Los Angeles to Nova Scotia. So John is the beginning of sort of conceptual art with all of this, and we'll just have the students write this out, and he wrote this all out for them, have them cover all the walls with this. And so finally the student printmakers themselves created this work with John's handwriting, and it was made as a fundraiser for the School of Art. But John did print the very beautiful work by Via Selmans. It's also in this sort of second room here, and went on to work with her on many things. It took her a long, long time. Her drawings translated into lithographs. It was just as long to make all of those lithographic images on the plates as it was for her to make them as drawings as well, and they're just exquisitely done. And in London, you know, there were simultaneous things going on. They were not necessarily printers who'd been trained from Tamarind that were working in London, but Editions Electo, which was started by an artist and basically a dealer, a publisher, Michael Deacon and Paul Cornwell Jones in Cambridge in 1967. They had a lot of technical ability that came from training in Paris, and they made that amazing piece, Pews, Brews, Stews, and Do's, using language from London pubs and organic materials like beans or axle grease or caviar that were related to whatever the words were that were there. And Edward Shea came back to Los Angeles and actually produced another two works. There was a Metrical Hollywood sign that was made the same year with Jean Malon at Cirrus. And the idea of having the Metrical, which was a diet drink at that time, along with caviar as in the making of the image, he was just sort of translating those things that were part of Hollywood into the works that he made there. But soon, Editions Electo, which continued to work, not in quite the same way, but Paul Cornwell Jones then opened Petersburg Press. He worked with David Hockney in 1963 to create the Rake's Progress series of works. David was still a student at the Royal Academy of Art, and Paul this was one of the most successful portfolios, sort of talking about a young man on his journey out in the world. So Paul soon left Editions Electo and opened Petersburg Press and worked with many different artists, but primarily he concentrated on David and published not only the work here, which is a lithograph, I think made with Morris Payne, was the printer on those things, who had trained originally with Oliver Cromwell. And he went on to publish the photo collages that David did, the Grimm's Fairy Tales. He put together a marvelous exhibition called Travels with Pen, Paper, and Ink that went to, I think, 30 or 40 different institutions around the world, which allowed everyone to know who David Hockney was by all the different places he had been and all the different images of his friends and different places he was at. He was amazing. Let's see. In Florida, there was a graphic studio that was run by Donald Saff. It was a part of the University of South Florida. It was outside of Tampa. Robert Rauschenberg found a sort of a home here on Captiva Island, very close by. And he produced hundreds and hundreds of lithographs with graphic studio. He was an extraordinary printer, and he was not afraid to make everything really big. So the technical quality of being able to make big and to have a student population that would allow the printing to be done cheaply was how they all kind of came by with all of those things. And in addition to some of these bigger publishers, there were a lot of independent publishers in California. One of my, L.A. Liver worked very closely with both Petersburg Press, showing not only David's work, but Jasper John's Fizzled for a while, a very beautiful book. Clemente did work with them as well. But we also worked with Catherine Brown at Crown Point Press in San Francisco. She was incredible and started in the early 60s working with both Wayne Thiebaud and Richard Diebenkorn. There is one work that is actually by Thiebaud that was printed at Crown Point Press that's here, but it was already going in a different direction. She worked a lot with Robert Bechtel, although this piece, which was produced for Documenta in 1972, was done somewhere in Germany there. And Crown Point Press in sort of the end of the 70s sort of started working more with conceptual artists. Catherine was married to Tom Marioni, the artist, and Hans Hacke, Chris Burden, John Cage were all kind of regular makers of prints with them in the studio, along with Diebenkorn and many others. And that changed over the years. My very dear friends, Karen McCready, worked with them for many years. She sadly died too young. But Crown Point Press continues today. Catherine Brown just only recently passed away. She was an amazing woman, and she developed a woodblock printing program. She brought artists to Japan to work with master woodblock printers in the traditional ukiyo printing methods, and that was fantastic. The last book, Jack Lemmon was another master printer who worked out of Chicago. He worked with a lot of, he did a lot of contract printing for Parasol Press and for Petersburg Press as well. And he created a record label as well, so he published Terry Allen's first Boris suite and the records that all went with that. But he also needs to be remembered not only for all the printing he did with everything, but for the starting of the Chicago Art Fair in 1980. And the start of art fairs, which we all take for granted now, and are very much a part of an international scene, and every major city seems to have one now. In California, or in the United States at that time, there were no art fairs. And so the idea that all of these different publishers and gallerists could go to these places under one, it was all in a big tent at the end of the pier. I actually served on the selection committee for a few years because I was the only person they knew from California at that time. And we had participated with Bernie Jacobson in the Basel Art Fair for some time. And there was also a small fair in Washington, D.C. So those were the sort of things that helped to change and to bring the print world into a bigger international place. Pace Gallery got deeply involved in printing, and the beautiful Larry Bell piece that's here, it's worth looking at closely. It's truly a three-dimensional piece. Pace held an exhibition of Larry Bell's work. We at L.A. Louvre did 4 shows with Larry, and remain good friends to him now. He's still sort of hanging about both in Taos but Pace did one of his first big shows in New York. They apparently sold nothing. They just put everything into storage, and 50 years later, they had paid the storage bill by the sale of any one of them. So that was really great. But Larry took those ideas of light and space and ideas of sculpture and the ideas that came out of what is sculpture, what is painting, those definitions, which were very fluid at that time. But the first PACE project that was done was with Lucas Samaras, and they did an extraordinary book of Samaras' thing, and to this day is one of Arnie Glimcher's most favorite things. And a lot of artists, I mean, beyond other things that went on, Denise Renee published the Robert Indiana work, Love, which became ubiquitous as sculpture and painting. But that image actually started out as his Christmas card. So it was sort of, it went out, it was a Christmas card, and then suddenly it's like, oh yeah, we're going to do something else with all of this. It's not to say Andy Warhol, with what he was doing, he saw very early on the possibility of really making these multiples. They were made in very large editions. I remember thinking, how can you make an edition of $250 and sell it for $500? This seems crazy at that point. And that's how they all were. And he formed a company within his own company called Factory Editions, ADDITONS. And it was a way that he could control the marketing of his own work in his own ways. He went on later to work with Ronald Feldman, who published a lot of things and other things over time. And Heiner Friedrich in Germany did the beautiful work with Fred Sandback. That was a line drawing that Sandback did, a very minimal kind of work that was there. And he worked a lot also with Dan Flavin and Donald Judd. And it's a whole other world of American artists that went to work in Germany because of the precision of all of the work that was there. I didn't even talk about all the things that Sol LeWitt did, but the printing of Sol LeWitt's things, which were radically different at the time, he just sent instructions and let people just follow what I say. And no, there were no drawings, there was nothing else that came out of all of that. And that's how all of this started. All of this started out of professional training, of looking at things and expanding every idea of how things could be made and what they could be made with. So the world we stepped into at that time, for me, at that late time in the 1970s, of coming and looking at all of these prints and finding homes for all of these things, was really amazing. I feel very, very lucky. And that is all. Any questions, technical or otherwise?
So what do you do now?
What do I do? So Ellie Luger now, 51 years later, has decided we are still in a business. We still have a business. We've stopped doing a regular exhibition program, and we have stopped having regular hours. The building that we built on Venice Boulevard is for sale, but we have a second facility that is in fact twice as big as the regular gallery. Half of it is storage and half of it is available for viewing. We'll do some pop-up shows for the course of the next year, and eventually the building will sell, and we'll see what happens. I'm doing more consulting. I'm working in the secondary market. I'm working still with Alison Saar and Gajin Fujita. We're going to participate in the Art Dealers Fair in November with a one-man show of Gajin Fujita. We are, there's, other little pop-up things are going. I've been working towards a retrospective of Alison Saar's work, which isn't anywhere yet, but I'm going to put it all together and someone will do it, because I will have done all the work. The show that toured, actually, 11 museum shows. Actually, a very funny story. Jordan Schnitzer, it took me a long time to sell to Jordan Schnitzer to begin with. He's an amazing man, and he has an energy like no one I've ever met. But when he was looking at Alison Saar's work, I finally put together, here's all the pieces that are available, and you can buy them for, it's a very small sum of money. at that time. Took 2 years for him to say yes, but I was persistent, got it done. And then I just said, well, what am I gonna do with this? I said, so if you have some sculpture as well, then we could put together a little show. And I put together a show that started at the University of North Texas and traveled to 11 museums, university museums primarily. And he published a book, and he has been very generous in the publishing of books. He's made 5 artists' catalog raisonnés of their works. He's produced another 15 really major monographs on different artists. When he has his passion that is there, he really goes the distance to see all that to happen. So that's what we're working on right now. We have, we've opened ourselves up to, we're working with the estate of David Hockney and Leon Kossoff and Ed and Nancy Kienholz we're still involved with. And all of those things, all of these artists that are with us or not with us, everyone is just moving on. So, you get old, then you can't do as much as you would like to do. It's okay. Any other questions? Yes?
What happened to Peter Shelton, who you showed off for you?
Peter Shelton is continued to work. He's actually has a studio full of work right now. He has never lost the vision of what he wants to make, and he has made it. He has found it difficult to be, with all due respect to everyone in the room, an old white guy that is making big sculpture that hangs on the wall and is heavy and difficult to move and expensive to move around. It's at a certain point in time he had just become not any less important as an artist, but just the focus went elsewhere. So there will be someone that is brave enough to take all that on. Actually, he told me about someone in New York that was looking at doing something now, so I'm thrilled. He still lives in Venice.
What's been an unexpected surprise about working in your life, in your field?
And expect what?
Like unexpected surprise, that's something that you've learned that you weren't expecting to.
Question. Would you repeat the question?
Oh, the question was, what was an unexpected surprise that I've had in my life? I am always surprised by people who are ungenerous in how they present themselves to other people and how they, you want to hear yes, you want to hear okay. You don't always have to say, yes, I'm gonna take that or do that, but I like a sense of generosity, and so I'm surprised when that doesn't happen.
Would you talk a little bit about the way in which you worked with George Kinser and the David Hockney show and sort of that sort of adventure?
Jordan had about when I finally kind of broke through, and I was looking at everything that he had, and I knew what David Hockney had, and I thought I've got to kind of find a way to put all this together, and it was quite an extraordinary moment in time where we were able to take what he had held, which was a lot of bits and pieces of a little bit of this and a little bit of that. There was no full through story, nor did he have any sort of interest in going back in time and really looking at all the early things as he needed to do in order to have a really complete holding of things. So I made a list for him of all the things that I thought he should own, and I gave him a list of all the things that David Hockney had in his own store of things that were available. Hockney was an artist who only sold through his dealers, and there were 5 dealers or sometimes 6 dealers, that were given access to being able to buy from him on a somewhat wholesale level. He was from Yorkshire after all. And we were able to, I put together, I said, okay, Jordan, here's all the things you have and here's all the things you need. I put them in a notebook so he could have a page turner of seeing not only the development of Hockney's work, but where his real gaps were in what he was doing. And so at a certain point, he made a big acquisition of everything that David had, which wasn't actually that much when all was said and done. But it was before that moment in time when he started producing a lot of digital work. And so when David had his first retrospective that was at the LA County Museum and the Met and Tate in 1988, I mean, he had one retrospective in 1970 that was at the Whitechapel. It was just sort of 10 years of work. And the next retrospective didn't come about until 1988. And it was after that time that, and at that moment in time, he had only made about 300 paintings. And maybe that many, I doubt in that many in terms of graphic works, but maybe so. But after that time, it was, by the end of the sort of 1990s, he was working in the graphic, all the graphic, as computer drawings became available, photographic works that he was doing. They were all moving at a very fast pace. He started producing a lot of work. So Jordan was able to acquire a lot of work on a very favorable basis, and then continued to buy. As David continued to produce things, I made sure that he was able to acquire everything. And it isn't just like, oh, you're lucky you get to have this. There's a huge demand for David Hockney's work. And if you can afford to just keep it, and what we've seen in the prices of some of the series of things that he's done, particularly a series called The Arrival of Spring, which were large landscape works, originally sold for $28,000, which seemed like a lot of money at that time. Now are selling for $250,000 to $800,000. It's insane. It's just crazy, you know, as we go back for all of that. And so, but he has kept up with some of that, and most of that as well. It takes a lot of cajoling. Yes.
Yeah, talking about prices and the kind of marketing and things. I'm interested in the print runs. Like looking at Bechtel, I see some there's 38, some there's 24. Who determines that? Is it the artist? Is it the dealer? Is it the reputation of the printer?
Originally, when things were being numbered, they would number things in etching days. They would start, the first one that came off the press would be number 1. Now printing is so uniform that it's random how those things are numbered. And the edition sizes are usually left to the publisher, and the ability of whatever material they're using to be able to produce that and everybody has their own formulas for those things. But generally, you know, unless you're selling, when things were being made in very big editions, even editions of 100 would be considered a big edition. It's a lot of selling. So you really have to have a network of things, of where things to go. But it's the publisher generally that is making that determination, and the printers, because they want to maintain the quality of all of that.
Is David Hockney still as shy as he was before?
No.
No.
Well, you know, he's passed away.
I didn't know that.
Okay. He passed just almost a month ago. It's only like mid-June he passed away. He had not been well for a while, and he was not necessarily as shy as you thought he was, but he was deaf. And so when the reticence came when he couldn't read your lips, or you were not speaking clearly, or you had some sort of accent. So he he would talk to you. You would listen to David, but you generally were not having conversations unless you were right across from him and you were talking right at him so he could read your lips. It was a inherited disability. His father was completely stone deaf very early. David had the best hearing aids anyone could have, and none of it really happened. There was no escape from what was to be.